All right, we want to welcome you to the Port Aransas Nature Series, and we're glad that you took time on Friday afternoon to join us. And we have a terrific speaker for you today. Dr. Becky Bowling is a former turfgrass specialist, and now she's a water specialist out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, working for Texas A&M AgriLife. And I've heard her speak multiple times, and she always does an absolutely terrific job. And we're very blessed to have her here today to talk about turfgrass maintenance. So we'll turn it over to you, Dr. Bowen.
All righty. Thanks, Kevin. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yep, looks great.
Yes. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, thank you guys for watching today and joining us. I know we've got quite a range of different people watching, and so, we're going to try to keep this fairly broad. We're going to talk about kind of all things turfgrass, and a lot of this will be kind of lawn-oriented, but we can apply many of these same principles to more professionally managed environments as well. So I wanted to start off today kind of briefly discussing turfgrass selection, which ends up being kind of the starting point for our turfgrass areas, kind of learning a little bit about the species that we're managing, or if we're choosing to renovate or plant a new area, having a plan for what species is appropriate there. So in the turfgrass world, we typically divide our grasses up into two categories, cool and warm season turfgrass. Cool season grasses are going to have what we call a bimodal growth habit. This means that they have two primary peaks of growth in the spring and the fall when temperatures are cooler. Warm season grasses, which is what we typically have here throughout a lot of Texas, is going to have the singular peak of growth usually in the warmer months. So we'll see it kind of come out of dormancy in the spring, take off, and then this time of year we'll start to see it start to slow down a little bit. We still got a little ways to go. So characteristics of these two different groups of grasses: warm season grasses tend to be more water use efficient. They tend to be more nitrogen use efficient. They have an ideal temperature range for new shoot production of between 80 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Because they're more water use efficient, they also tend to be more drought hardy. And a lot of times they tend to have better stress recovery because they do a great job of producing lateral stems. Cool season grasses are going to be a little different. They're not going to be as water use efficient. They're not as nitrogen use efficient. They typically produce new growth between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's about 2 weeks of the year here in Texas, and we're experiencing one of them right now. They tend to have a higher disease incidence and poorer stress recovery. If we actually look at how these species are split up into these two camps, we have 14 primary species that we see used commercially for turfgrass here in the state of Texas. 7 of these are going to be in that warm season category. 7 of these are going to be in the cool season category. So you can see here on the left, you're probably familiar with several of these. Bermudagrass and St. Augustine grass are going to be the most planted warm season species here in Texas. After that, we'll see zoysia grass as being planted the third most often. Bahia grass is going to be one that we see as more of a utility turf option, although we do have some improved varieties that we may see used in more conventional managed turf systems. Buffalo grass is going to be our primary native turf grass option. Centipede grass we'll see more in acidic parts of the state with heavy rainfall. Seashore paspalum is one that we actually see most often in the coastal bend right now. It's going to be one of our most salt tolerant options of all of these that you see here. And then on the cool season side of things, many of these we may see used more in North Texas and up through the Panhandle. 2 of these that we may see more often as we go down through Central and South Texas are going to be annual and perennial ryegrass. And the reason for that is that those are commonly used as an overseed option for winter months in warmer climates so that we maintain green vegetation. Now, if we go really far south in Texas, a lot of times our warm season species will tend to stay fairly green throughout the year, so we may not necessarily need to utilize a cool season grass for overseeding. So I wanted to go into these in a little bit more detail just briefly. So Bermuda grass, here's a picture of Kyle Field. Not sure if anybody watching today is an Aggie grad, but this is Kyle Field. Bermuda grass is going to be a pretty versatile grass here in Texas. Again, it's going to be one that's one of our most planted options. It's certainly going to be the primary option that we see for sports fields, park areas. The main reason for that being that it tends to be the most resilient and wear resistant of all of these options. It's going to tolerate that sports traffic, and it's going to recover quickly from it in a way that many of our other species may not be able to. It also is able to tolerate lower mowing heights, which we typically prefer in these types of professionally managed sports field environments. It's going to be very drought tolerant. It's not going to be as shade tolerant. That's going to be one of its weaknesses. It also can sometimes be more aggressive than we'd really like for it to be. We have a lot of different varieties of Bermuda grass available. Common Bermuda grass is going to be one of the cheapest and most economically viable options. And then we have several hybrid Bermuda grasses or special selected varieties of Bermuda grasses that will have some improved characteristics. You know, they may be more attractive, have a more unique color, have some improved cold or drought tolerance, and those tend to be also a little bit less invasive as well. Now, St. Augustine grass is going to be one that we typically like to utilize in more shaded or partial shade areas. It does really well in those environments compared to Bermuda grass. It also has, many of you know, a thicker leaf blade, a coarser texture that many people find desirable. Tends to do best here in Texas in areas where we get a decent amount of rainfall throughout the year. As we go further west, we will still see people grow it out west, but it just may not do as well, or it may require more supplemental irrigation. Even in the case of St. Augustine grass, we typically recommend that it receives a minimum of 5 to 6 hours of light a day to really thrive. If it gets too much shade, it will really struggle. When it's healthy, the density is very helpful in reducing weed pressure, but it does have a few weaknesses, including that it is not as traffic tolerant as Bermuda. It can be susceptible to diseases depending on how we manage it. It's not always particularly cold tolerant, and it is going to be our most susceptible turf to chinch bugs. Zoysia grass, again, is going to be our third most planted option. It is a very versatile grass. We have kind of coarse and fine textured zoysia grasses and a variety of different species of actually the zoysia genus that we utilize for turf applications. Some of these are more cold tolerant than others. Some are more drought tolerant. Some are more shade tolerant. So chances are, depending on your situation, you can find a zoysia grass that works well for you. Now, zoysia grass is a little different in terms of how it needs to be managed to be successful. So certainly, you know, we may see that it requires more cultivation or thatch removal than some of our other species. It also typically is going to require less fertilizer, which is a bonus. And it can be susceptible to select diseases, including large patch disease. Here's some little side-by-side so you can kind of see. So on the left here, we have an example of a finer textured zoysia grass. And on the right, we have an example of a coarser textured zoysia grass. So in general, as kind of a rule of thumb, a lot of our fine textured zoysias tend to be more shade tolerant, but they will often require a little bit more intensive management program to really stay healthy. Our coarse textured zoysias are going to typically be more cold and possibly more drought tolerant. They also tend to perform a little bit better in a home lawn scenario where we're using typical home lawn management practices, but there are some exceptions to this on either side. And so again, a lot of versatility and diversity here, and it can definitely be easy to find a zoysia that's a good fit. If you're interested in a little bit more information on turf grass selection, there's a lot of great resources that are available out there. One of these is the Water University website, which we have a couple of different publications. They're catered a little bit to North Texas, but there's still a lot of great information in there about warm season grasses. We also have several resources on the Aggie Turf website, which we'll talk about some today. That's aggieturf.tamu.edu. And if you click on our publications page, you'll find a whole bunch of resources that you can download for free to use for turf grass management. And then another resource that I really like is our producer producer's website, which is texasgrass.com. This is where you can find information on all of our turf grass producers in Texas, the species and varieties that they grow, and where those locations are within the state. I did want to touch a little bit briefly on shade before we move forward. So even the most shade tolerant turf grass will generally require a minimum of 5 to 6 hours of light a day to really do well. You know, even St. Augustine grass, again, is going to have its limits. When we have too much shade in an area, what we'll start to see is that the turf grass will start to thin out or die back. We may see an increase in weed encroachment because of that exposed soil. We may see an increase in disease activity because the shade is stressing our turf, and we may see reduced overall stress tolerance. So in those situations, you know, if we can prune back our trees a little bit and increase filtered light, that's one approach. We may also have to explore turf alternatives, and there are a lot of good options here. So this is another AgriLife Water University resource that has some alternatives for shaded areas in here. Another resource that I really like is some of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center resources. So it's wildflower.org, and they actually have plant lists by Texas ecoregion, and you can kind of sort through there to find plant material that might be a good fit for areas that are heavily shaded in the Coastal Bend region. Now, once we kind of have chosen our turf, or we have a little bit greater understanding of the species that we're managing, then we want to start thinking about our different management practices that go into that. So we're going to start off today talking a little bit about mowing, then we'll move to irrigation. We'll talk briefly about cultivation. We'll transition then into nutrient management and fertilization, and then we'll just kind of briefly go over a few pest management considerations. You know, we've got a limited window of time today, so it's a lot to try to cover, but certainly as we have questions that come up, I'm happy to get to those. This is actually a good point, Ray or Kevin, if we have questions about turf selection, species or cultivars, this is a good point to talk about that. For some of our other questions, we can see if I maybe get to them here in a minute, but do we have any questions on turf selection?
No questions so far.
Yep, we don't have any questions on Facebook yet either. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So let's just get right into mowing then. So we typically define mowing as the intermittent removal of leaf tissues to support a particular aesthetic or function. This is, of course, probably the most common management practice that we see implemented in turf. So even if we have an area that we don't really irrigate or we don't fertilize, etc., we often still will mow it to keep it maintained properly. Now, it's important to remember that mowing is a stress that the plant tolerates. So certainly if we do not mow appropriately, we will see consequences to this in our turf. And so this is something that we want to be mindful of. Appropriate mowing practices include considerations of proper height, frequency, and equipment maintenance. So we'll talk about each of those here. One of the first things that we want to keep in mind is when we are mowing our turf, we really want to take steps to avoid scalping. And scalping is when we injure the turf by removing too much of the above ground growth at one time. Now there is kind of one exception to this, which is that sometimes you will see recommendations for spring scalping to help remove thatch and debris from the previous year. Primarily, we might recommend that for Bermudagrass or zoysia grass in particular. However, the rest of the time, particularly during warmer months, we really want to avoid scalping our turf. One of the first things that this can lead to is increased soil exposure and just general stress on our turf, which can lead to an increase in weed encroachment. So just more of that soil is exposed. Our turf cannot outcompete those weeds as easily. So we'll see a lot of weeds start to move in. We also see a relationship between scalping and certain turf grass diseases, including large patch disease. And we are actually starting to see this disease show up a little bit here in Texas with this drop in temperatures and some rainfall that we're getting in certain parts of the state. And then finally, just in general, we get a reduction in stress tolerance. And so, if we remove too much of that vegetation at one time, we have to remember this is how the turf feeds itself, right? It photosynthesizes with that leaf material. If we remove too much of that at once, it just puts the turf in shock. A lot of times to make up for it, it will pull carbohydrate reserves out of its roots. We really don't want to do that. We really want those roots to stay strong and vigorous, because that is what really allows our turf to be successful. So I did think I would just briefly introduce the crown. So the crown is the primary growing point from which all turfgrass organs or components originate. So you may be familiar, if you are a big gardening fan, you may be familiar with something called the plant tip or the apical meristem on a lot of our other plants, including some of our vegetable crops. It's that point at the very top of the plant where new growth, new leaves are being developed. In the case of our turf grasses, this point is actually going to stay closer to the ground. And this is what actually allows these turf grass plants to tolerate mowing practices, because when we go through and we mow, we're not actually removing that critical point where new growth occurs. But certainly if we scalp or go too low, we may cause injury or create an issue there. Now, the next thing for us to think about is mowing height. This is the desired height of our turfgrass canopy. An appropriate height is going to be determined by a bunch of different factors. So it's going to be partially determined by the species. It's going to be determined to some extent by the environment that we're in, our management capabilities, and the intended use of that area. So you can see I've got a few different pictures here on the left. We maintain a golf green at a very different height from an athletic field, which we maintain at a very different height from a home lawn. And so it all just kind of comes down to, what am I using this area for? What are my goals? Typically, when we maintain a turf grass at a much lower mowing height, it's going to require much more frequent mowing. So for example, on a golf green, we will often see that those greens are mowed every day, if not twice a day in some cases. And we also see that it generally leads to an increase in demand by the plant for water and nutrients, because it's just being maintained at such a low height that it's just going to need a little bit more help to keep up with that. So kind of a rule of thumb when we're thinking about mowing height is that in general, the taller our turf grass is, the deeper the roots can be. And particularly as we move through the season and we get into those warmer months, our goal should be to try to have the deepest roots possible. We get a lot of benefits from taller turf and deeper roots, including improved water infiltration. So you can think of all of these roots that are produced as being channels for water to move into the soil. The deeper those are, the deeper that water can move as well, and that just allows us to capture more rainfall when it comes. Those roots also have access to deeper soil resources, including nutrients. We get improved overall stress tolerance, again, when we have deep, healthy roots. And our taller grass can also be beneficial in crowding out weeds. Many of you may be already aware of this or have seen this. If you've got a St. Augustine lawn, when you keep it at a little bit taller height during the hottest months, sometimes it tends to perform a little bit better, and we typically don't see quite as many weeds growing in that St. Augustine turf compared to a lawn that maybe is being maintained at a much lower mowing height. Now, we do want to stay within the recommended height range for our species, and I'm going to share some of those ranges with you here in a second. If we let it get too tall, then we start to potentially attract pests that we don't want, including fleas and ticks. We get an increase in fire ant activity a lot of times, rodent activity, and potentially snakes. And also, if we happen to be in a more humid area, having taller grass leads to a buildup of humidity in those leaves, and then that can lend itself to disease activity. So our goal should be to try to have relatively tall turf that's still manicured and where the canopy can still have good air movement throughout it. So this is from a mowing recommendations guide that I created that you can find on the Aggie Turf website, and it just kind of breaks down some of our primary warm season species and in general some of the recommended height ranges that we might recommend for those species. So you can see there Bermudagrass, hybrid Bermudagrass, we can typically keep a little bit shorter because it's bred to be more compact. So we're looking at anywhere from 1 inch to about 2.5 inches. For common, we might keep it just a little bit higher. St. Augustine grass, we typically recommend that you maintain it between 2.5 and 4 inches. Again, this just, this is a coarser grass, and a lot of times St. Augustine just performs better if it's kept at a slightly higher mowing height. Now, in terms of mowing frequency, mowing frequency is really going to be driven by the rate of growth. So we know that there are times of the year that our turf grass grows much more aggressively than other times, and we're having to be out there mowing it a little bit more often to keep up with that. So, again, just being mindful of when our turf is most likely to be growing. And as much as possible, we want to follow what's called the 1/3 rule. This just means that we avoid removing more than 1/3 of the total canopy height in a single mowing. So again, this requires that we're trying to kind of monitor, keep up with growth as we get through the season. Now, if we do keep a slightly higher mowing height, a lot of times, we don't have to mow as frequently. Think about it. If I'm keeping my grass at an inch height, it's going to get 30% taller a lot more quickly than if I'm keeping it at 3 inches in height and I'm waiting for it to get 30% taller. So keeping the turf a little taller, and then if an area does become overgrown, just strive to gradually take it down over several mowings instead of lopping it all off at once and again scalping your turf. All right, any questions about mowing before we move on to irrigation?
None so far.
Awesome. Okay. Easy peasy. All right, so after mowing, irrigation is probably going to be our second most common turfgrass management practice. The way that we irrigate can make a significant difference in the way that our turf performs and its overall health. A lot of times we do really need to supplement irrigation in many parts of Texas throughout the summer. It just gets so hot and dry that we need to give our turf a little something to keep it going. But it's really important that we don't overwater during these periods. It's estimated that here in the state of Texas, about 50% of the water that we use in a household goes toward the landscape, particularly during the summer. And of that, 50% of that ultimately is runoff and not used by our lawn or our plants. So that's a lot of water that we're potentially wasting. So we want to do our best to try to avoid that with good irrigation management practices. So a couple of common irrigation issues that we see, of course, overwatering. Sometimes we see that the irrigation system that we have is not designed well or it's not installed properly. Sometimes the way that our irrigation system is programmed may just not serve us. We may have it scheduled for the wrong time of day, the wrong time of year. The frequency or duration may not be beneficial to us. So these are all things that we want to think about. We do want to make sure too that we have a plan for properly maintaining our irrigation system. So, really thinking about how you're going to monitor that and make quick fixes as needed. So typically, a lot of our different turfgrass species are warm season species. They have variable drought tolerance. And so depending on the species that we have, we can kind of adjust our irrigation practices to reflect how drought tolerant that species is. So buffalo grass, which is our native option, is certainly going to be the most drought tolerant. Unfortunately, buffalo grass doesn't typically do well in parts of the state where we get more than about 35 inches of rain a year or more. So a lot of times does a little bit better for more in kind of that central channel of Texas, all the way up through the panhandle. Bermudagrass is also going to be very drought tolerant. Coarse textured zoysia tends to be fairly drought tolerant. St. Augustine grass can be more of a moderate water user, although there are certainly steps that we can take to improve how water efficient that it is. And we also do have a lot of turfgrass breeding efforts here at the Dallas Center, actually, where our turfgrass breeder is always focused on trying to improve drought tolerance overall. Most of our turf grasses are what we call drought avoidant. So what this means is they actually handle drought by developing really deep, vigorous root systems that allow them to, quote, avoid the drought. And so I'm really sharing this with you guys to point out or to emphasize that having encouraging deep roots, maintaining a deep, healthy soil profile for turf grasses to root more deeply significantly improves the way that these grasses respond to drought. A lot of times I may ask somebody, how deeply do you think a Bermuda grass turfgrass area roots. And a lot of people may say, oh, 2 to 4 inches. And we may see that a lot of those roots are concentrated in the upper 6 inches or so. But when conditions are optimal, we can see Bermudagrass root several feet, greater than 10 feet into the soil if we have a particularly deep, sandy soil that really allows for that. So to the best of our ability, we want to encourage the deepest roots possible. This was a study that was performed actually in San Antonio about 20 years ago now, where they actually looked more at this concept. And what they found was, they had kind of 2 main treatments they imposed. One of these was that they restricted the root zone at about 4 inches. And the other treatment was that they let the turf grasses root as deeply as possible. And they looked at, I think it was just over 20 different species and varieties of warm season turf. And what they ultimately found was that if the root zone was restricted, and these grasses could only root 4 inches into the soil, they ultimately were going to die the second that there was any kind of significant long-term drought event. If the turf grasses were permitted and encouraged to root more deeply, then they may go into what we call summer dormancy, meaning that they lose their color in the summer. We call it going blonde for the summer, but ultimately they're able to recover when water becomes available again. So how much should I water? PhD answer is it depends. It depends on the species that you're maintaining, expectations for that area, the function of that area. So for high traffic areas like parks or sports fields, we typically have to water a little bit more to keep up with the wear on those areas. Whereas if you have a lawn that you're primarily just looking at but not putting a lot of wear or traffic on, we don't have to water as often. Other management practices, including fertilization or mowing, will also drive irrigation demand, and capabilities, what kind of equipment we have, etc., will play a role as well. A lot of the watering recommendations that you'll see from Texas A&M AgriLife are actually driven by something called evapotranspiration. This is a combination of the words evaporation and transpiration, and ultimately what it adds up to is the amount of water that's lost from a turfgrass area as a function of climate and species and environment. So it's influenced by things like soil moisture, temperature, wind. All of those things play a role in kind of estimating how much water is lost, and then we want to supplement or replace how much water we estimate is lost so that we can be as efficient as possible. So here's a little bit more on transpiration. This is specifically the water that's lost from the plant. And you can think of this as kind of like plant sweat. Okay, so this is something that plants do to cool themselves. And the same way that we have pores, plants have something called stomata. They're openings in the leaf where we get some gas exchange and water loss when plants are trying to cool themselves. And so this is one of those things that really drives water loss. And again, a lot of different things play into this. So environmental conditions certainly, but also plant characteristics. So the rate of water loss from a plant may be very different for a turf grass compared to one of our trees, compared to our agave or whatever else we have in the landscape. So these are some different numbers to kind of show you during the warmest months of the year when we have the greatest evapotranspiration. These are the estimated watering requirements based on historic ET data or evapotranspiration data throughout many parts of the state. So GNR is going to stand for generally not required. These are parts of the state where we may not recommend watering very early in the year. In places like Corpus Christi and other areas throughout South Texas, you guys tend to have a longer growing season. And so this means that you may be automating your irrigation or watering at times of the year that other parts of the state are not. But in general, what they have found is throughout these primary growing seasons, most turfgrass areas are going to require between about 1/2 inch to 1 inch of supplemental water per week. We should adjust this based on precipitation. So if we do go through a period where we receive a lot of natural rainfall, we want to make sure that we turn our irrigation off and that we're not overdoing it, we're not overcompensating. A lot of times in winter months, we will typically discourage people from keeping their automated irrigation on. as we get into late September, October, a lot of times I recommend that people consider turning off the automation in their irrigation system and switch over to manual watering. And this just, you turn the water on as needed based on stress. But, what we know is a lot of times, even if our turf doesn't go dormant, growth tends to slow because our temperatures cool. We're not transpiring or seeing as much evaporation, again, because our temperatures are cooler. And a lot of times we get more natural rainfall in many parts of Texas through the fall and winter. And so we want to just, for those reasons, switch over to only watering on an as-needed basis. And again, always turning off or adjusting your irrigation based on natural rainfall. Now, let's say that I do want to program my irrigation system to water my lawn about a ½ inch or an inch of water per week. In order to really implement this and have this be successful, I have to know the precipitation rate for my irrigation system. So one way that we recommend going about finding this out is doing what's called a catch can audit. And this is where, these are actually real catch cans. You can also use something like tuna fish cans or coffee cans. But the idea is that you kind of space these out within your irrigation zones. You run your system for a set amount of time, like 15 minutes, and then you go through and you measure how much water has been put out by your system during that period of time. And this just allows us to learn how long do I need to run my system to put out my desired number of inches, okay? And this is really important. And a catch can audit can also shed some light sometimes on maybe there's a malfunction with our irrigation that, we can't see right out of the gate. Maybe there's not a 20-foot geyser, but when I run my system, I see that this corner receives 2 inches and the same amount of time, this corner over here receives ½ an inch. Well, that indicates to me that something needs to be adjusted or fixed. Maybe the design is flawed, or maybe I have a head that's stuck and not rotating properly, so it's hitting one area for a prolonged period. So a lot of different things to think about there. There is a great video that was put together by Water University that teaches you how to do this. It's just 2 minutes long. So you just look at determining sprinkler efficiency, the catch can test, and you can learn how to do this catch can audit for your lawn. A lot of times this is something I recommend doing, particularly in the spring. So when you're thinking about, getting going for the year and temperatures are about to warm up, kind of having a plan to look closely at your irrigation system and look at all of this in advance. You can purchase catch cans on the AgriLife bookstore, or you can purchase them a lot of other places. So if you're interested in having these in your collection, doing a little shopping and finding a good place to get all of this for you. Now, other little irrigation tips for turf just to kind of keep in mind. We typically recommend that you water deeply and infrequently. So common mistake that many homeowners make or turf managers make because they care so much about maintaining their turf is that they may be out there watering every single day and not watering very deeply. They're just kind of giving their turf a little spritz. What we really want to encourage is that we water to about a 6-inch depth every time we water. If we're dealing with a sandier soil, we may strive to go even deeper than that. And then we want there to be enough space between our waterings that, that upper part of the soil starts to dry down, because what this does is it motivates our turfgrass roots to reach for that water that's still there deeper in the soil. So if we go out there and we just water, the upper inch or two of the soil every day, we're going to end up creating a codependent turf baby that produces roots that just kind of stay right there in the upper part of the soil. So deep and infrequent irrigation, typically we don't need to water more than 1 to 2 times a week once our turf is established, provided we can really water deeply each time that we water. Now, some of you, depending on the soil type, we have a lot of different types of soil down there in the coastal Bend area. One challenge that we may face is getting our water to that deeper depth. And so one thing that we can do to help with that is called cycle and soak irrigation. This is where we program our irrigation system to pulse water into our turfgrass area more gradually. So let's say that I do my catch can audit and I learn that I need to run my irrigation system for 30 minutes in order to put out my desired output. Well, instead of running it for 30 minutes in one go, what I might do is program my system to run 3 times for 10 minutes. and have a 30 to 45 or even a 60-minute rest in between that allows that water time to infiltrate before I come back and hit it again. And this can help reduce my runoff losses and just allow that water time to move in more gradually. If you're interested in this, you know, a lot of our new irrigation systems already have a way of programming this that's really simple. Even if you have a little bit older system, typically if you go on the manufacturer's website, they are going to have some kind of instructions for how to program your system to do this. Another thing that we can do to improve water efficiency is to consider swapping out our nozzles. And so if you're spraying a turf area, sometimes these multi-stream rotors will be a little bit more water efficient than a spray nozzle. We may have less evaporative losses. It's a slower stream to improve coverage and infiltration. So that's one thing that you can look at. We also recommend that you water early in the morning. If you water in the midday, you tend to have more evaporative losses. If you're watering in the evening, you can prolong the period of leaf wetness. So your turf just stays kind of wet and soggy overnight. This can lead to some disease issues. So early morning watering allows our turf to use that water quickly and efficiently with minimal evaporative losses, but then also allows the turf to dry out quickly as well. So a lot of times I may recommend that somebody waters between about 3 a.m. and 9 a.m. if possible. Another option is that we can supplement with rainwater. You know, a lot of people choose to do this for their garden beds or vegetable bed areas, but you can certainly do it for turf as well, capturing rainwater when it comes and utilizing it. This can also be helpful if you're dealing with a water quality issue. So if you're dealing with a water source that's particularly salty, then this can be a one way around that to improve water quality. We also want to take advantage of technology. So having a rain sensor or rain shutoff sensor can be beneficial to make sure we're not the person that's watering in the rain. We're not the person that's watering a day after we got 6 inches of rain. And there's a lot of new technology out there to help you improve water use efficiency and really be able to water as effectively as possible. Just do what you can not to set it and forget it. Staying engaged with your irrigation system is typically the best way to be water efficient. Any questions about irrigation before we move on to cultivation?
None here so far.
No.
Awesome. Okay. All right, so I did want to talk briefly about cultivation. You know, in the case of turfgrass systems, we're typically cultivating to do 2 primary things. One is to alleviate compaction, and compaction refers to the compression of soils that limits their space for air, water, the space for roots to develop properly. This is something that we see commonly with many of our Texas clay soils. Compaction can be brought on just by the physical and chemical nature of those soils and the water that we use. We also see compaction occur as a function of a lot of foot traffic on a sports field, or if we have a heavy riding mower that we've been using on an area for a long time. All of these things can lend themselves to soil compaction. The other thing that we want to manage sometimes with our cultivation is thatch buildup. And you heard me talk about this some when we were talking about zoysia. Thatch is going to refer to this intermingling of living and dead tissue, typically between the leaves and the roots of your turf. So it's going to be where all of our stolons and rhizomes and decomposing material kind of meet. And when this layer gets to be greater than about 1/2 inch in thickness, we can start to have some consequences for our turf. It affects water movement. It can kind of repel water or be a barrier for water to move in where our roots are. We also see an increase in disease and insect activity right there. And so those are all things that can become an issue and that we want to try to address. Now, if you're not sure, you know, a lot of times for a lawn type area, I typically recommend that people only cultivate on an as needed basis, meaning that you're seeing indications that that area needs to be cultivated. If you are dealing with more of a high traffic area like a park or sports field, those are areas where you typically want to have cultivation as part of your overall management plan. So if we're looking for signs that cultivation is needed, one indicator may be standing water. Now, this can also be an indication that we just have a low spot, or we have a malfunctioning irrigation or broken irrigation. But certainly, if you're seeing that water is not infiltrating in an area, that can be an indicator that the soil is just too compacted. It's like concrete. There's nowhere for that water to go. If we're seeing a lot of thatch buildup, one thing that we might feel is that our turf starts to feel very puffy or spongy under our feet. Similarly, if I go out there with equipment, my equipment may bounce or skip on it because it's just very soft. And that can indicate that maybe there's some thatch that needs to be managed there. If we're seeing a lot of bare soil or thinning turf, this can sometimes be an indication of compaction. Many of our diseases may be associated with either too much thatch buildup or some compaction. So if you have a lot of disease activity, that may kind of indicate to you that you may need to have a cultivation routine. And then certain weeds tend to proliferate in very compacted soils. So dandelions, goosegrass, these are weeds that we may see more commonly in a compacted soil over a non-compacted soil. So in terms of practices to implement, one of the first of these, there's a lot of different pieces of cultivation equipment out there now. I'm going to kind of talk about two sort of categories for this, but certainly if you're a professional watching, there's many other options available to you. So one of these that we might recommend is going to be verticutting or vertical mowing. This is a piece of equipment that's designed to slice vertically into the turf, specifically for the purpose of removing thatch. We also see it used sometimes to help thicken up thinning turf. It slices into those rhizomes and stolons and can kind of stimulate new growth from those points. Now, this is not a practice that's really going to do much for me if I have a compaction issue. This is really going to be more of a superficial turf canopy thatch management plan. A lot of times, what we would recommend for any of these cultivation practices is that we would implement them in the late spring, early summer. So that actually is incorrect. So I apologize. Those should be kind of flip-flop, but late spring to early summer is when our turf is actively growing. We tend to have a little bit more natural precipitation during that time of the year, so it's just able to recover from those practices better. Now, with some species, certainly we can get away with doing cultivation practices at other points in the growing season. But we just want to be cautious. This is going to injure your turf, so you don't want to do it and then have it be exposed to extreme heat or extreme cold or anything like that, where the injury is going to be much greater than it needs to be. With this practice, we do want to bag and remove that debris. And just know that thatch removal, thatch management, again, can be especially important on zoysia grass areas. So if you are maintaining zoysia grass areas, it is pretty important to have some kind of cultivation plan together. All right, the next practice is going to be aerification or aeration. These terms are often used kind of interchangeably. A lot of different pieces of equipment out there. If you're dealing with more of a heavy clay soil, we typically recommend a hollow tine or a core aeration where you are physically pulling plugs out. I'm just not sure that spikes are going to be sufficient to really help you in those heavy clay soils, depending on what your goals are. Aeration is going to be the practice that we implement when compaction is the issue. Again, this is one where we have a lot of different pieces of equipment. They go to a lot of different depths, and so some of this equipment may only go 2 to 4 inches into the soil. Some of it may go 16 inches into the soil, depending on what I'm using. So, a homeowner can go and rent some of this equipment to use on their own. If you do that, just remember to mark your irrigation heads, know where everything is. It's going into your soil, so you can do some damage. And you can also hire some landscape companies to offer this as a service now as well. If you do choose to do aerification or verticutting for that matter, be sure that you're able to offer your turf sufficient water to help it recover within 24 to 48 hours. You don't want to just let those areas dry out after, again, you're subjecting them to this injury. You know, it's being done for a purpose, and there will be benefit, but you want to make sure that the turf really has everything it needs to recover from it. A lot of times we may recommend following these practices with top dressing, where you're using a sand material or something like that to really improve or kind of cover those areas and improve the quality of the root zone. You may also consider fertilizing during these periods as well. As you know, you've got some of those soil is exposed, and we can kind of get those products maybe a little deeper into the root zone. All right, so now we'll kind of go into talking briefly about nutrient management. So the main thing that I really want to stress here is I am a big advocate for customized nutrient management. So this means test your soil, learn about your soil, and cater your nutrient management or your fertilizer program to what your soil test says. For a really long time, we kind of had these blanket recommendations for what fertilizer to use in turf, and those recommendations commonly lead to over-applying phosphorus and potassium. And in the case of phosphorus, we get some environmental consequences to that. So again, I really recommend, test your soil. We typically suggest that you pull 10 to 15 samples from across your yard. You want it to kind of be representative of the whole area. You can combine those in a 5-gallon bucket. We typically want to collect those samples at about a 6-inch depth. Then once you've kind of mixed everything together, you can fill up a soil testing bag, which you can pick up at your local AgriLife County Extension office, and fill out the associated soil submission form. And then you can just package all that up and ship it to our soil testing lab. For very basic soil tests, you're looking at about a $12 cost. If you want to add micronutrients, so you want to learn a little bit more about iron, zinc, and things like that, it's going to be $19. I often recommend that you do this anytime between every 1 to 3 years. So just kind of depends on what you're doing. If you're taking a lot of steps to try to change your soil, then you may test more frequently to kind of monitor that. If not, every 3 years may be sufficient. If you do go through our soil testing lab to get your soil test done, once you get those results back, there are some useful calculators and stuff on their website to help you make sense of that, or you can contact your county extension agent, or you can contact somebody like me to help you kind of make sense of what those test results say. There's also several publications on the soil testing website to help you as well, and that's soiltesting.tamu.edu. So, for most of our nutrients, which we have actually 18 different nutrients that plants use, most of those we only want to apply based on what the soil test specifies. The only exception to that might be nitrogen, which generally, because the plant uses it so much and there's so much research on this, we typically know how much nitrogen, or approximately how much nitrogen, to apply to keep our turf healthy. And so these are the rates annually that we might recommend by species. We only want to make these applications when turf grass is actively growing. So a lot of times what I might recommend to a homeowner is that they make 1 to 3 applications a year. So for example, a Bermudagrass lawn, I might suggest that you fertilize in May, July, and September, and do about 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet each time. And that's typically going to be pretty good to keep it going. Now in parts of the state where we do have a longer growing season, you might add a 4th application and kind of redistribute how you space those out. Again, we want to only apply fertilizers when turf grass is actively growing. This means that we're actively out there mowing it. That's an indication of growth. And we want to put out our final application for the year, typically about 6 weeks before the historic first frost date for our part of the state. We just don't want to put out too much nitrogen too late in the season, because as we start to cool off, this can feed disease. And if we do happen to get a frost, it can increase the likelihood of winter injury. So really concentrating our fertilizer applications on those warmer months. If you're dealing with an area where the turf grass is greater than 25 years of age, you can typically do a little bit less fertilizer than a younger area. We just see that older lawns tend to have more stable nitrogen available, just a little different. When we do fertilize, we want to try to keep that fertilizer on the turf. So that means sweeping granular products or prills back into the turf. If you're using a liquid product, trying to avoid overspray onto the sidewalk or driveway. Make sure that you choose the right piece of equipment. You understand how to use that equipment so that you can really get good distribution. A lot of times, what I might recommend is putting this on the lowest setting and crisscrossing back and forth to get more even coverage of a product. A lot of times I'll get somebody that tries to calibrate their equipment, but they end up halfway through their yard going one direction and they've already used up all their product. And so, putting it on a lower setting, having the product come out more slowly and doing a little crisscross back and forth can really help to improve coverage and uniformity. I am a big fan of mulching your clippings instead of bagging them. There are some exceptions to this, which I'll talk about, but in general, when you mulch your clippings or recycle your clippings, you can reduce your fertilizer requirements by 25 to 50%. So that's pretty beneficial. Now, if you do have a pest infestation present, and that includes things like weed infestation, disease, insects, those are times where we do want to bag and remove those clippings so that we don't spread that problem around. So we'll just kind of wrap up talking very briefly about pest issues, and then we'll do some questions here at the end. So we don't have a whole lot of time to go into this in great detail today, but I am going to present my integrated pest management approach, which includes 5 prongs of control for turf. The first of these is going to be preventative. This is where we're smart about the material that we bring into our turf grass areas, being cautious about new seed, new sod, any soil, compost material. Also, another thing that kind of falls into this is equipment cleaning and maintenance. So just taking steps to prevent the introduction of a pest in an area. Cultural management means that we're doing everything we can to keep our turf healthy and competitive so that it is less susceptible to pests. So good mowing, irrigation, fertilization, and cultivation practices. Mechanical control, a lot of times in turf, this is primarily going to refer to pulling weeds by hand. It can also refer to regular mowing, which can help suppress some pests. Biological control is, any natural enemies of our pests that we may bring in to help control them. And then chemical control is the use of chemical pesticides, and this can also include the use of organic or quote natural products. It doesn't have to just be synthetic pesticide products. So because we are getting into the fall, I thought I would briefly touch on pre-emergence herbicides. This is the time of year that we really are thinking about that. It's appropriate for us to put those out now in North Texas. Typically for more southern parts of the state, you might be able to push it a little later into the season. And I also have another recommendation for that as well. But pre-emergence herbicides are herbicide products that we use to prevent primarily annual weeds from coming up in our turf area. In the wintertime, we may be really focused on preventing specifically something like annual bluegrass or Poa annua. You may also have some broadleaf weeds that come up like henbit or burr clover. So putting out a pre-emergence herbicide just helps me to establish a chemical barrier to kind of keep those weeds from coming up in the first place and becoming an issue for me. A lot of times in the fall in particular, I'm looking at putting those products out when my soil temperatures reach around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, or if I've got ambient temperatures of about 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 or 5 consecutive days. Now, in the case of more southern parts of the state, what I might recommend is that you actually look at doing multiple applications, particularly if you are a professional watching, if you're working for a landscaping or grounds crew or something like that. What we see is because the winters are milder in that part of the state, weeds will continue to germinate over a very long period. So following label instructions for a split or sequential application program in the fall can be very beneficial. If you want more information on this or you want to talk about it more, just shoot me an email after the program. Now, if you're a homeowner watching and you're curious about how do I even find a pre-emergent herbicide, I do have a couple of resources that can kind of help walk you through this. This is from one of them, and it kind of shows you what a common box store herbicide product may look like. And one of the things that we really want to pay attention to is going to be this list of active ingredients. So You know, a lot of times people may get overwhelmed when they go into a box store and they're trying to find a product and they just see so many different options. But if you can find that active ingredient listing and you can kind of make sense of what those active ingredients are, it can really help you. When it comes to a pre-emergent herbicide, a lot of times a product at the box store will not necessarily say pre-emergent. It'll say something like weed preventer or crabgrass preventer. So you might look for that language. Then in your active ingredient list, you're going to look for, these are probably the most common active ingredients that we see used for pre-emergent control in box store products. It kind of talks to you about what they control, where you can find them in some products. It offers a few notes for you as well. And this particular table is on a guide that you can actually download for free from the Aggie Turf website. And it's 2 pages, just 1 page front and back. And it kind of answers questions about pre-emergent herbicides and has that table on it. So if you're interested in that, you can just download it for free, aggieturf.tamu.edu. We also have the larger herbicide guide on there, as well as different guides for disease and insect issues as well. This is my email address here, so it's bgrubs@tamu.edu. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have some questions. You know, sometimes it may take me a few days to get back because I get a lot of emails, but I'm happy to receive those and try to help you as best I can. That's what I've got in terms of slides. We got some questions.
No questions generated here. Any on Facebook?
No on Facebook right now, but I have a question. This is Ray with Nature Preserve. We are interested in trying to get homeowners to utilize native turf grasses, but so far from what I've heard from some seed companies I talked to, that like buffalo grass, they seem to think would not grow well on Mustang Island. Do you know of any examples of it doing well in the coastal environments, or do you have other recommendations? And I sold as sod, because people really, you know, they don't want to wait for the grass seeds to grow. They want the sod.
Yeah. So I would say kind of 2 different things there. So the first is that, yeah, in general, we see that buffalo grass tends to not do as well when we are receiving more than about 30 to 35 inches of rain a year. Now, some of that can vary depending on when that rain is primarily received. And so if you guys are getting more of that rain during cooler months, then those grasses may do okay as long as they can stay fairly dry. The other thing that I can tell you is that we do have some buffalo grass sod production in Wharton and in Bay City. And, you know, it does better than I expect in those areas. Now, you know, it's being managed there by professionals, and so they have that expertise to maintain it and keep it healthy. But it does indicate to me that, you know, hey, maybe some of these sodded varieties would do better than we expect. So, but yeah, in general, we see that if it gets too much water, what we see with buffalo grass is that starts to get some disease issues. It gets a lot of weed encroachment and weed infestation by other things. And we also see that buffalo grass is not particularly salt tolerant. And, you know, a lot of times in the coastal bend, we're dealing with water quality concerns or things like that. So that's another limitation as well. Now, the other thing that I'll offer you is that Seashore paspalum, which I talked about briefly today, they believe is actually native to the Americas. So it's not maybe native in the same way we think about buffalo grass, you know, being kind of from the Great Plains, etc. But I believe that this is considered native to the Gulf Coast, and it does have excellent salt tolerance. And we do now have a sod farm in Texas that is producing a sodded variety of it called Platinum. And so, you know, that may be an approach as well. And then I'm happy to do a little bit more research for you too. And again, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, they've got a lot of good information on natives by ecoregion. And maybe if you get on there and look at kind of their coastal recommendations, you may find some things that would work really well there, but we just don't utilize them in other parts of Texas. But finding those as sod may be more challenging.
Yeah. Thank you. You guys have any questions? Okay, I guess that was our only question.
Alrighty, well, you know, if anybody thinks of something later, just have them shoot me an email, and I'm happy to help them out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Bowling. That was an excellent presentation, and We want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we have these once a month, the second Friday of each month at 2:30, and you can get to them through the Nature Preserves Facebook page. So next month we'll have Dr. Michael Womack, who will be talking about plant diseases. So if you like what you heard today, the presentations are all been excellent so far. So thank you, Dr. Grubbs, for
Absolutely.
Dr. Bowling for coming and presenting for us today.
You guys have a great day.
You also.
Bye-bye.